Welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
There's one thing which is Sufism as a thought, as a philosophy, as how, man perceives his stature as a microcosm as well as an ashraful makhluqat. So you can have that complete, width where the Sufis see man as nothing but a minutest of minutest creation. But at the same time, he's the greatest creation. So that, as well as the fact that Sufism manifested itself in art, in craftsmanship, in science, mathematics. And so looking at that bandwidth or that wide spectrum of influence that Sufism had, it was but inevitable that I lost myself to it.
That was author Moin Mir talking about how Sufi philosophy influenced him from an early age, which also provides the backdrop to his latest historical novel that glows with the essence of Sufism, the lost fragrance of infinity. Moin was in conversation with historian and translator Rana Safvi about his book and its background in a BIC stream session in early June 2021. This is an extract of that conversation conducted in collaboration with the International Music and Arts Society. Now, over to Rana.
He started writing under the influence of his grandfather, a scholar of Sufism, Umar Khayyam and Mirza Ghalib. He is the author of the critically acclaimed book, Surat, Fall of a Pot, Rise of a Prince. This book, The Lost Fragrance of Infinity, is his second book. And this book, steeped in Sufism, is also something which goes with Moin's background. He is the descendant of Hazrat Maudud Chishti, one of the stalwart founders of the Chishti Sufi order. And he is also the kind of the Nawab family of Surat and next in line to succeed his father at the Darbar of Kamadia, Gujarat. He lives in London with his wife. And before I start asking Moin about his book, I'd just like to quote Karl Ernst. For the Sufi tradition, the Quran frames all of time and eternity into 3 days. Yesterday is the day of creation when God created the universe and sealed the destiny of his lovers. Today is the world when all are called upon to live according to God's wishes. Tomorrow is the resurrection and the judgment day when souls will testify against themselves and be held to account, and God's mercy will be displayed. And just now we are in a moment of infinity and in which Moin will be bringing out its fragrance for all of us to savor and to enjoy. But I'd still like to ask you whether this book is a result of your childhood steeped in Sufism and the fact that you're descended from a Chishti saint, one of the founders of the Chishti Silsila. And why is it that you chose to write this book as a novel and not as a non-fiction?
Firstly, thank you so much, Rana Appa, for introducing me and for agreeing to be here and talking about my book. It's an absolute honor to be here with you. And I also thank Urmila Devi ji and Indira and everyone at BIC for giving me the opportunity. Yes, I was deeply influenced by my grandfather. He was a man who was very active in two societies in Bombay, which were the Theosophical Society as well as the Indo-Arab Society. And his works, alongside Dr. Rafiq Zakaria and other illuminaries, deeply influenced me as I was growing up. Particularly his analysis of Umar Khayyam's philosophy and the way Mirza Ghalib looked at the stature of man and his philosophy, rather than looking at Ghalib merely as a poet. Having lived under, his stewardship for many years, and my grandmother's stewardship, I was drawn towards Sufism from a very young age. Also, the fact that one's ancestry in some way or the other, somehow always looms in some kind of a fashion over your rather weak shoulders when you're a young boy or a young girl. And in many ways, this particular legacy that had come down from generations of Hazrat Maudud Chishti, it didn't lie heavy on my shoulders. In fact, it lured me to understand Sufism right from childhood. The virtues of humanity, the virtues of seeking within, and the virtues of looking for creativity within you as you kind of look at yourself as part of the greater creative force. So these were things that influenced me as a child. It brought me into a sense of understanding of Sufism from a standpoint of thought, as well as Sufism from a standpoint as a creative energy. So there's one thing which is Sufism as a thought, as a philosophy, as how, man perceives his stature as a microcosm, as well as an ashraful makhlukat. So you can have that complete, width where the Sufis see man as nothing but a minutest of minutest creation. But at the same time, he's the greatest creation. So that, as well as the fact that Sufism manifested itself in art, in craftsmanship, in science, mathematics. And so looking at that bandwidth or that wide spectrum of influence that Sufism had, it was but inevitable that I lost myself to it. To your second part of the question about, why did I write it as a novel? I did spend many years thinking about how I could tell the story of Yusuf and Zulekha, or for that matter, the passionate love that Ibn Arabi has for Nizam. And at the same time, how does one write about this extraordinary mind of Omar Khayyam, where you have mathematics and mysticism merging seamlessly? And I thought it would be vital to tell a human story through which these elements would emerge, and the reader could then enjoy, a narrative which is relatable, as well as not deviating from the core ethos of Sufism. So yeah, that's how I went about it.
You've done it so beautifully in the book. I thoroughly enjoyed reading it, and I'm sure whoever reads it, and there are many people today with us who are hearing us, and I hope all of you will buy and read the book. He's done a wonderful job in that. But Moin, another thing I was thinking about is that today when we think of Sufism, we think of dargahs, we think of kabbals, we think of that heady fragrance of incense and rose and the petals, etc. We forget that actually Sufism is a rigorous ethical discipline, and at the heart of it is the Wahdatul Wujud, the concept that Ibn Arabi propounded. And there are the fact that it is not an easy path. Not everybody can just start on it. Tie this up in your book also when you talk of a point in which you say that it is from this point where classical Sufism starts to decline. So can you just give us a brief account of what Sufism actually is, and the growth, as well as what Ibn Arabi was talking about when he talked about Wahdatul Wujud?
I think you've struck upon a very important chord, Rana Appa, how you started off your question. You're absolutely right. The manifestation of Sufism as that takes you to dargahs, or that takes you to the shrine of the very revered saint, so that you get a boon granted, is something that we all do. And I've done that. I still do that. And listening to the qawwalis is absolutely glorious, and it's deeply soothing, no doubt. But it is not the complete, if you would say, essence of Sufism. It is just one rendition or one aspect of it. I, for one, make it amply clear when people ask me, are you a Sufi? I say, no, I'm not. I'm someone who's inclined towards it. I'm someone who's drawn and absorbed in it. But I'm not a Sufi as one would expect a Sufi murshid to be. It takes an elevated thinking and an extraordinary amount of great, as you rightly said, discipline. There's a lot of inward journey, internal introspection, a sense of khidmatul khalq, which basically means your selfless service to humanity. How do you carry yourself through tasawwuf, which is deep meditation and contemplation? And so it's Sufism. When Rumi gets quoted, when there's some quotes of Rumi that are put on music CDs and all of that, it baffles me, because that really isn't what it was about. It was about really discipline. I wouldn't use the word strict. It wasn't, but a sense of discipline in administering yourself in a space that you've been given. And that space is life. And how do you administer yourself within that greater realm that you as a microcosm are occupying? And how do you see yourself in the true words? And what is your stature as man as compared to the universe, the creative force that you're part of, etc., etc. Deep, deep, deep question. And the stalwart philosopher, who was a giant in many ways, and I wouldn't say he's forgotten, but as you rightly said, that when you talk about Rumi, or the West, has made Rumi out to be this rock star, and he was not. And the one giant who actually was the champion of Sufi philosophy was Ibn Arabi. And he came up with this concept of Wahdatul Wajud, which basically means the unity of being and the absolute essence. And it's an incredibly, it's a difficult concept to understand. I wouldn't even say that I've come close to it. You can read Ibn Arabi 1,000 times over and you wouldn't have even come close to where he's reached. But in whatever time I had, and I had the good fortune to study Ibn Arabi in a university in Istanbul called the Koç University, and I also happened to read him in Andalusia, which was fantastic. Whatever little bit I've understood is Ibn Arabi sets the pace for creation. And he looks at the concept of creation and the result of creation through the lens of metaphysics. And his belief is that there is this unity of being. And from that unity of being which exists, you have different attributes. And now I'm just completely simplifying it because it's a very, very deeply complicated subject. And Ibn Arabi was, accused of pantheism, and his books were burnt in Bukhara for what he had written. But anyways, so you've got the unity of being. And from the unity of being, you've got attributes. So you can have mercy as an attribute. You could have wadud, called love, as an attribute. You could have magnificence as an attribute. And all these attributes are given names, which went on to become the 99 names of Allah. And those attributes, according to Ibn Arabi, manifest themselves in every creation that the unity of being has created. So in many ways, you start becoming a part of that overarching, supreme creative essence. And so when he put that concept out, it was very difficult for the petty-minded, if I may use that word, the petty-minded clerics to understand. And, they could not understand where this man was coming from or what he was saying. And it was only over a period of time when he was written about, analyzed in greater depth by many other Sufis, including Hazrat Abdul Quddus Gangohi, who lies buried in Uttar Pradesh, and many other great Sufis, did the concept of the unity of being and the attributes get a sense of understanding. So, that's my humble answer to your question.
That's a beautifully, very well explained, because as you said, it's a very, very difficult concept and it takes almost an age. Even I'm at the beginning trying to understand it.
Yeah.
And all of us are, I think, outsiders trying to understand Sufism, because to become a Sufi, to take a bayat, that is an oath of allegiance, all that requires a lot of discipline, and it's a lifelong quest. So we are still outside looking at it.
Exactly.
And another thing, in your book, there's this sentence which struck me as very, very interesting, something which I'm sure everybody is going to, whoever reads it, enjoy. There has been, Sufism has also produced a lot of literature, and as you rightly talked about Umar Khayyam and his contributions to the astronomy, and Ibn Arabi to metaphysics, etc., etc. There was a lot of emphasis on ilm, aql. बिना अकल के इश्क हो ही नहीं सकता है. That is the premise. कि जब तक आप to understand, you to know him, you have to first understand yourself, and to understand yourself, you need ilm and aql. So there is your hero at one point of time, I think it is Qaraar, who says, somebody asks, who's Leonardo da Vinci? And the answer is, he's Umar Khayyam of the West. So I'd like you to just go a little forward on that, talk about the emphasis on the sciences, on ilm, on aql, and talk about the development of science in the East. Because I know that you have, you mentioned in your book, The Lost Enlightenment by Frederick Starr, and he has talked extensively about how developed the sciences were in the medieval ages.
I think it's important to also take one step further back to understand, not to understand, but at least try and get a sense of what that Sufi mind was. The first thing that happened when the Sufis understood the likes of Hazrat Ali, who according to most of the Sufis was the first Sufi, and Ibn Arabi, they went into an inward journey, understanding themselves inward. And the minute you started that inward journey, there was a sense of, I wouldn't say awakening, but a sense of an intelligent quotient that kicks in within, where you become curious, So all these Sufis had an incredibly curious mind. They wanted to know geography. They wanted to know the world. They wanted to know the earth. They wanted to know the streams, the rivers. How did they flow? How did the forests survive on their own? The atmosphere, science became the next door that they opened because of the curiosity of mind. The first thing that happened to them because of the inward journey was the development, as you said, aql, the development of a mind that is curious, that is open to innovation, and that is open to invention, and that is a mind that is not constrained by dogmas. The minute that happens, you have the Sufis then foraying into the sciences under the overarching umbrella of spirituality and the unity of creation. So they are not divorcing themselves from spirituality, neither are they divorcing themselves from their faith. They are taking those elements and becoming innovative, curious, and inventive. As a result of that, you have this flourishing of Sufis that really starts in somewhere, I would suspect, in the 9th or 10th century. And then there's a real battery of Sufis. They're a constellation, they're a galaxy that emerges from Central Asia and then into Persia. Deeply, deeply influenced by the mathematics of India and of Greece. These Sufis take it onto themselves to take a deeper dive into it. And so what you start seeing from the 9th century onwards are the likes of Al-Khwarizmi, who is in Persia, and who starts learning about this fantastic Indian mathematician called Brahmgupta. And he unequivocally, pays glowing tributes to Brahmgupta. Then you have, Omar Khayyam, who, really advocates the fact that it is through understanding spirituality that you can understand logic. Now, this is probably one of the most difficult concepts to understand, because what he's saying is, under the banner of spirituality, you have logic and reason, and the organized system of mathematics comes within that. So, and then by the time he's studying in the libraries of Merv, which is in modern day Turkmenistan, he's inventing modern day cubic equations. He's understanding the relationship between metals and alloys. He's trying to figure out how do the metals and alloys exist simultaneously. And then you have the likes of Qudat al-Hamdan, who's deeply entrenched in Sufism, and goes on to become a mathematician who takes Omar Khayyam's geometry even further. Then you have Buzjani, who comes up with concepts of the polyhedrals and the triangles, merging together. So you have this constellation of great minds emerging out of Central Asia, and then making their way into Persia, deeply, deeply curious about the world, about the sciences, about mathematics. And then, of course, you have the giant like Ibn Sina. And there was much debate whether Ibn Sina was a Sufi or no. But Ernst Bloch, who's a great student of Ibn Sina, in his book Avicenna and the Aristotelian Left, makes it amply clear that Ibn Sina was given to mysticism and a sense of deep spirituality in his writings. And then you've got Ibn Sina, who, writes probably the greatest encyclopedia known as the Canon of Medicine, which goes on to become the greatest book on medicine in the East and the West. So the East had its fantastic glory days, right from Brahmagupta, and then this incredible burst of a galaxy of great Sufi theologians as well as scientists emerging from Central Asia. And that span is all the way from the 9th century till the 14th century, because the greatest jewel, if I would say, that emerged in Andalusia after the death of Ibn Arabi was Ibn Khaldun. And in the 14th century, Ibn Khaldun is the first man to sit down and say that history and geography should be addressed as sciences, not merely as chroniclers who write history, but also understand how does history affect sociology? How does sociology affect our societies and geography? So that was the effulgence and the effervescence of this fantastic Sufi mind that absorbed. That mind became a sponge. It absorbed knowledge. And that's how it kind of flourished.
And you then go on, beautifully explain, Moin. You then go on to, of course, talk about the fact you say that Europeans were pushing the boundaries while the three great empires, that is the Safavid, the Ottomans, and the Mughals, were on the decline. And you make a point that this is where classical Sufism starts to decline, and even the knowledge that you talked about so eloquently. So can you just elaborate on that for our audience?
So as we get into the latter half of the 17th century, three events happen which, in my humble opinion, signal the end of this curious, innovative, inventive Sufi mind. First is the death of Dara Shikoh, who was not just a Sufi for the sake of being a Sufi, he was a practicing Sufi. The works of Dara Shikoh, I don't even need to talk in great detail about them because they are accepted and known as masterpieces, particularly his Majma' al-Bahrain. The compassion that Moin Mir instilled in Dara Shikoh's heart towards cultivators, once again, is a very well-known fact. So Dara Shikoh is murdered in 1659. In 1666, Shah Abbas II, who was again one of the finest minds, dies at a very young age. He died at the age of 35. And his Persia was, this intellectual bastion, a melting pot of thinkers, philosophers, writers, poets. The likes of Saib Tabrizi were in his court. And he dies, unfortunately, in 1666. And in 1683, against the wishes of the Sufis, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed VI attacks Vienna and loses. And from these three events onwards, you have the contraction of these empires and the diminishing influence of the Sufi in their intellectual theaters. Because you suddenly have, I wouldn't say an immediate vacuum, I wouldn't say that, but you don't have that Sufi influence where he is in court influencing the ruler to invest in science, mathematics, innovation, ocean navigation, painting, literature, poetry, and you see that contracting from the late 1600s. And as you're one of the finest historians in Delhi, Apa, I don't need to tell you this, but it takes time for decay to set in. And as 200 years or 300 years pass, the Sufi is then confined, as we've spoken about, only to going to a dargah and making a wish and listening to a qawwali and going away home, I mean, it's beautiful. I still do that and I still enjoy it. But the larger cultural realm of the Sufi has diminished in luster.
And I hope that your book comes and fills in that gap.
That's very sweet.
Thank you so much. And the one part of your book, something very dear to me, is the architectural aspect of it. So architecture in the Islamic world was inspired by the sense that it is sacred and therefore also a replica of the cosmos and the locus of the encounter of man and the divine world. And everything led to the oneness of the divine. And that's what you've talked about. The square shape reflected the holy Kaaba. The octagonal shape called Hasht Bahesht was inspired by the divine throne, which we call Arsh, which is supported by 8 angels. The dome was a reminder of the vault of heaven, beyond which is infinity. That came through so beautifully in your book. Can you please explain for us the term sacred geometry, which I've heard you talk about very often, apart from the book, before this also? And what do you mean by Gireh Sazi, the importance of Gireh Sazi? And the second part of this question, so that you can continue that, is why was restoration so important for Qaraar, more than creation? And why did Qaraar find it easy to restore but difficult to create? And how does Qaraar go through this journey? And I'll ask you, after you answer that, I'll ask you to read out a passage from your book.
Sure. I think the origins of Girah, it's debated. It's debated, heatedly debated amongst experts. And I'm not an expert on that. I had the good fortune to listen to Peter Liu, who's an expert on geometric tile work in the Islamic world. He's a Korean professor, absolutely fantastic. So there are a lot of debates. They say some say it originated in Central Asia, some say it originated in Persia, some say in Arabia. No one really knows the real truth as to where it originated from. But Girah in Farsi, in Persian, means knot, to tie a knot. And the Sufis were at the forefront of craftsmanship in their khanqahs, in their retreats, in their schools and madrasas. One of the crafts that they propagated was Gireh tile making. And the tile making is all about these fantastic geometric shapes knitting together and coming together. And when they come together in their variety and in their diversity of shape, they all culminate in a star. That star is supposed to be the sign of enlightenment or an illuminated mind. And as you rightly pointed out, the square resembles the Kaaba, the octagon is the quest of the infinite, and which is all about interlocking the diversity we behold in our eyes in our quest towards enlightenment. Now, when I was in Bursa, which many experts say, boasts of the finest geometric tile work in the world, and I didn't know that till I actually went there. There's this small mosque. It's called the Yesel Kami Mosque. It's called the Green Mosque. And when you go in there, it's rather unassuming. But when you look around and you look at the blue geometric tile work, it is absolutely glorious. You have octagons, pentagons, triangles, all of them coming together, knitted together, and then reaching out towards the star that is almost, beckoning them. And then they repeat the design so that it gives you this pattern of infinity. And I happened to meet a Sufi there. And there was a craftsman as well. And they spoke about the sacred geometry. And they told me about how greatly influenced these empires, whether it was the Ottomans or the Safavids or the Mughals, how greatly influenced the craftsmen were because of Gireh Sazi, because it truly appealed to that heart of the Sufi that brought people together. And their explanation was probably not as articulate as the way you've explained it, but they were people, they were men of hand and clay. And they said, the square represents a different race. The star represents a different race. The triangle represents another culture. And it's all about different cultures coming together as mankind, to better ourselves and to seek enlightenment. And that is the juice of Gireh Sazi. It is about bringing human beings together and then displaying that as an art form.
I think that coming together is what you bring together so beautifully in your book. And that brings me to the next part of this question, which is the art of restoration, which Qaraar is so good at. And can you read a short passage from your book to explain how Qaraar, through the journey of his life, restores the spiritual lives of his friends like Alf the slave trader, Huwa the prostitute, Gul the unloved royal princess, and the hated acrobat brothers, because he restores all their lives.
Yes, and I'll just take a step backwards. I thought it was vital that I create a character that is sensitive, that is vulnerable. And through his eyes and through his feelings and through his turbulent life, the reader will be able to see the philosophies of Sufis that he uses to restore his life. And he's a craftsman in Delhi. He's young. He's in love with a woman. And he sees in her the link to the divine. And her name is Abira. And he's not besotted by her. He's actually deeply, deeply in love with her because he uses the philosophy of Ibn Arabi to see the attributes of the divine in her. And there are parts of the book where, he tells her that because she asks him, I don't see you going to a mosque. And he says, I don't need to because in you carry the divine quality of rahmat or mercy. And if I see that in you, I can see that I can see him. So, so these are the philosophies of the Sufis through which he is able to understand what it is to be in love and what it is to love the divine through the created, ishq-e hakiki through ishq-e majazi. And she, in many ways, is not just an inspiration, but she's is probably what Beatrice was to Dante, or what Nizam was to Ibn Arabi, or what Shak-e-Nabat was to Hafiz. It's that link where you are able to see such beauty in that one person that you're able to behold the divine. And unfortunately, without revealing the plot of the book too much, he loses Abira. And his life is nothing but an arid desert because he can't create without her. And he's not able to put things together. But before all of that happens, he is under the guidance of a Sufi who migrates from Isfahan during turbulent times and who takes him under his wing and has taught him this really unique art form called Gireh-sazi, which is making geometric tiles. And, it is through that compassionate heart of the Sufi that he learns how to knit, different shapes of geometry together into creating these beautiful aspects of these beautiful panels of tiles. But as luck has it, he loses Abira and he's trained by the Sufi to restore, not to create, because the Sufi coaches him into believing that restoration is more important than creativity, because creativity needs restoration. Restoration doesn't need creativity. It is that aspect of restoration where you're able to go deep within yourself and bring life back and give something back to something that's been damaged and broken. And so that becomes symbolic of his life. And as he begins this journey towards Central Asia and Iran, typically like a gireh tile, he attracts different characters to him. He lands up meeting Alf, who's a slave trader, who's a ruthless man. And then he lands up meeting Hova, who's a prostitute. He lands up meeting Gul, who's an Ottoman princess who's never really had true love in her life. And then he lands up meeting two brothers who are acrobats, but who've been tormented all their lives. And through the compassion in his heart and through his art, he influences their lives to finding spiritual bliss, if you wish, or spirituality. So I'll just read a small passage. I'll read two passages, if that's okay, two rather small passages. One is a passage when he's in Istanbul and he's restoring some tile work. And one of the Ottoman princesses, is quite smitten by him. But she's had a life of heartbreaks, and how he kind of makes her believe that the only way to look at love or get true love is by destroying your ego. So I'll read that passage first. Qaraar looked at Gul and said, "What matters is true love. Where can I find it?" She pressed her forehead against his shoulder. "Let it come to you." "I have been waiting so long." As they got up to leave the library, Qaraar gave his hand to Gul. Helping her up, he said, "Rumi says, carnal ego gets in the way of true love. Overcome ego and love will find you." Their friendship grew, and Gul began spending more time with the troupe. When Qaraar couldn't accompany the troupe for their performances, Gul went with them instead. She displayed Qaraar's styles on his behalf. Gul loved being with the troupe. It was freedom. Then it happened. One day, Gul was able to get permission for the troop to visit the shrine of Gul Baba in Budapest. Gul Baba was a much revered Sufi by Christians and Muslims alike, and for his Urs celebrations, the Habsburgs gave special permission for pilgrims to travel from the Ottoman lands. Gul meant rose, and she had been named after the great Sufi. After weeks of traveling, the troop reached Budapest. On a little hill next to the shrine of Gul Baba, various stalls were assembled, and the area was bursting with festive spirit. When it came for the troop, the two acrobats led the way. Hikmat, who was one of the acrobats, did splendidly and was showered with coins. Gul noticed that, and instead of keeping all the coins for himself, Izzat, Hikmat's brother, ran towards the destitute and gave them some. It was pure kindness of heart. Then came Izzat's turn to do acrobats. Against the backdrop of Saad's drum beats, Izzat's attempts to walk the tightrope in midair failed as he slipped and fell. The crowd jeered. He got up and tried again. Saad increased the volume of his drumming, but he failed again. Izzat dusted himself, got up again on the tightrope and walked. Veering slowly, he somehow reached the middle of the rope and looked down, catching Gul's eyes. There was only truth and sincerity in his eyes. When mockery was at its sharpest, Gul's heart absorbed it and reflected love back. Effortlessly, while still looking at her, Izzat completed the other half of the tightrope. The crowd's jeering turned into cheering. How fickle men were. At the shrine of the hermit Gul Baba, Gul, the royal princess, had found true love in Izzat, the acrobat. And I'll read one last quick passage, which is at a time when, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted it to be a human story, because sin is again another thing that's debated, so often. And the way one particular Sufi looked at sin inspired me to write this particular passage, and his name was Sarmad. And, there is no one in this world who hasn't sinned. We all have. And Qaraar, at this point in time in his life, is a murderer. He has left his home. He is in love with a lady, and he's also sired a child that is not from wedlock. So he's carrying this enormous burden of sin. And it is only through a prostitute who guides him towards the verses of the great Sufi poet Sarmad that he finds some solace. One night, Qaraar woke in the middle of the night shivering, having broken into a cold sweat. He got out of bed, wrapped himself in a shawl, and rushed down the stone stairs of the guest house. Flinging the door open, he sat on the steps that opened out into the street, breathing heavily. There was nothing but silence. An ominous feeling of being sinful descended on him. He thought of his relationship with Catalina, which in reality wasn't formally within the confines of a marriage, and about Sana, his love child with Abira. He felt an acute sense of conflict within him. His love for both Catalina and Sana was deep and sparkled with truth, but yet the voice of sin gnawed at his conscience. He whispered questions to the divine, at times begging for forgiveness, and yet also thanking the divine for making him the benefactor of true love. His face was buried in his shawl, his lips murmuring those questions, when he heard the approach of soft footsteps and a voice. "What sin are you talking about? Look at me." "Hova?" "Yes, Hova, who was once a prostitute. Do you want to talk to me about sin?" Hova also hadn't been able to sleep that night, and when she heard Qaraar rushing down the steps, she had followed him. Then she continued, "Fate has its ways. You and I are only its slaves. I didn't choose to be sold as a prostitute." Qaraar nodded as he felt a lightness listening to Hova. "We sit not far from Sarmad's shrine." Hova pointed in its direction. "Think of these verses and hold them close to you when you feel burdened of sin. No doubt that greater than sin is your mercy. Always everywhere, I've all of my sins added up totally. Though from head to foot I'm filled with sins, in spite of this, they do not exceed your mercy, obviously."
Very, very beautiful. And something that we often forget is that God's mercy is far more overpowering than his wrath. And that he talks of his mercy. हम कुरान भी जब पढ़ते हैं तो बिस्मिल्लाह रहमान रहीम कह के ही पढ़ते हैं. So the thing that we keep emphasizing is his benevolence and his compassion. And that's another, brings me to another line in your book which struck me, and I'd like you to talk about that. You write, for the Sufis, the Holy Quran wasn't a rule book to impose on others, but undertaking a journey within oneself. Now, we read the Quran, we read it very often, and we read it mostly without understanding it. Even those who understand do not understand the mystical meaning behind it. That is only for maybe the जिनको कहते हैं बहुत पहुंचे हुए हैं जो Sufi हैं, only they can understand the mystical meaning. Can you just explain what you meant by this? That it's not a rule book; it's a journey.
Yeah, and that's a lovely question. It's at a stage in the book when Qaraar finds himself in Bursa, which is a small town now, not far from Istanbul, and he happens to encounter a Sufi calligrapher who talks to him about many things besides he talks about power and politics and how the Sufis viewed power and politics, but he also talks to him about how the Sufis looked at the Quran as well as themselves, and they did not see the Quran as something that is meant to be imposed on you, on me, on others. It was not a rule book. It was supposed to be a book to guide you, to understand yourself. It was supposed to be understood as Ibn Rushd once said, understand the Quran as a philosophy. Don't understand it as a rule book. Understand it about how do you as man see yourself amongst others, amongst nature, amongst the greater creative elements that have been created. And so it's about taking the aspects of the Quran which are deeply spiritual, things like mercy, things like understanding the quality of forgiveness that we should all have within ourselves, and most importantly, eliminating hypocrisy. In Urdu and in Arabic, I think there's a word called munafiqat, which the Sufis strived to get rid of. And they thought that the Quran was the way to go within and understand the hypocrisy within themselves, which pervades everyone, and overcome hypocrisy and destroy ego and hypocrisy within. So it was about understanding the Quran in a way which was philosophical rather than a rule book to be imposed, but something that would create a desire to simply just understand yourself.
That's so beautifully explained. And I'll just have one last question before we take on the audience questions. There are quite a few of that. Like Qaraar, you have also traveled from the east to the west. So my question to you is, the saying, it's an eternal saying, बहुत ही favorite saying है, कि home is where the heart is. So have you found your dil ka Qaraar in the West, in London now? And I know that your book is dedicated to Leonie, and आप उनको बहुत प्यार से बेगम मीर बुलाते हैं. So have you found your muse in her? It's a question.
That is such a sweet question. In many ways, the answer to that is a big, bold yes. And yes, I think I crave for the East, no doubt. When I was traveling through India, Delhi, for research, Turkey, Andalusia, all of these places. It was a journey, yes, but I have to admit, I have found peace in the West, and I have found a place where I can be myself, and a place from where I can, embark on many journeys within. Yes, Leonie has been vitally important for this book. If it wasn't for her, the book wouldn't have been written, and it's as simple as that. And I think when you meet someone who is, who gives you that gives you that, or allows you to link yourself with the beauty within her, then creativity and creation, whether it's a book or it's art or it's craft, it becomes way easier.
That is something that comes through in your book because of the way that you have described how initially Abira and then Catalina both serve as not just ke wo ishke haqiqi hai and ishke majazi hai, but they are both the muse of Qaraar. And that is something that over the 1 year that I've known you and I've seen your conversations and I've been following you, is the feeling that I got that Leonie is your muse. So I'm glad about that.
It's very true.
Thank you for hanging in there and listening to the full conversation. If you liked what you heard, do share it with friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew behind this podcast is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Episode artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu, signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.